Now, so you started collecting license plates when you were 2, 3 years old. So you're obviously extremely precocious. And it is truly the passionate collector that starts something and not only stays with it, but becomes one of the preeminent experts in his field. And Richard is in the Hall of Fame of the Automobile License Plate Collectors Association, and has written a wonderful book which I have yet to read, and I cannot wait to read it. Motor Vehicle License Plates, registered in Rhode Island. Motor Vehicle License Plates and the registration of motor vehicles in Rhode Island since 1904. And it's one of those things that we were chatting before about things that, one of the reasons that we're so excited about this exhibition is that it really highlights the advances in invention, things that we take for granted today, that are just everyday. But you realize somebody had to start that. So, you know, we all know we have driver's licenses, we have license plates on our cars, but obviously it wasn't always that way. And so one of the things that Rich is going to teach us is sort of why it happened, how it happened, and what it meant when this all came about. And one of the things that I'm really interested in seeing, because I'm always fascinated with some of the license plates that I see. I've been here in Rhode Island as a resident for 3 years now, and I confess to having great license plate envy. I've got a bunch of vanity plates myself, but I see some of these plates and they're ridiculously low. And when Richard said that, well, you know, some of those plates are actually still in the families of the people who first had those plates, it's like, I'm going to find those people. I want to know who they are. So this is very interesting, and what you'll also be able to do, Richard will show you some of the plates that he's brought with him. There's some plates there on the table there and also on the other side. So during the presentation and after the presentation, most importantly, take a look at some of those plates because they tell such a wonderful story of character and invention and design and history and everything that we stand for here at the Audrain. And I know that you also have a couple people who are going to ask you in the Q&A about some license plates of theirs. So everyone is very, very passionate on a topic that one might think is sort of slightly academic, but Richard will prove that's not the case. Richard, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, hopefully it's not mundane tonight. I'm not an auto history guy, first of all, so Donald, feel free to jump in if I get any of my auto history facts wrong. But I do know something about when registrations came out, and as in most cases, you know, when new technology comes out, it takes a while for regulators, public officials to get caught up, and it takes a while for everything to settle, and it takes a while for the result or the effect of new technology. And what I'm getting at is it took a while for the states to begin registering cars after cars came out. My understanding about cars introduction is that it happened in production of automobiles began in 1897, as far as I know, possibly 1896. So that's the starting point. No cars prior to that except for experimental prototype cars from the early, the pioneers, the early, the Ransom E. Oldses and the Elwood Hayneses of the world. And then in 1897, the cars start to appear, presumably initially in low quantities, but production begins. And by 1900, there were reportedly 8,000 cars in the United States. There were no registrations then, there were no license plates. But the next year, everything changed because in 1901, registration began. So again, it's a 4 or 5 year delay between the time cars start hitting the road and when registration starts, when public officials and others with an interest in it figure out that we need to do something to keep track of these vehicles. So what I'm going to focus on first is that period from 1901 to 1917, the 17-year period when all of the 48 states, there were actually 45 states in 1901, but by 1917 there were 48 states. I'm going to focus on this period the first part of my presentation is in this period when states went from nothing, no registrations, to registration systems that pretty much resemble what we have today in their foundations and what it, as Donald said, as what it means to have a license plate. Certainly, license plates have changed a lot. in the last 105 years. Registration systems have gotten more complex. But in general, the things that we know about registering our cars have been in place since, my perspective on it is 1918. Now, this is just I'm a hobbyist, I'm not a professional, so this is just my take on what I see in the early records. So, in 1901, well, let me back up for a second. The way I'm going to frame this is I'm going to present first what happened from 1901 to 1917. Then I'm going to show you some of the early plates and up to 1939, which is the term of this exhibit. And then I'm going to finish off with some Rhode Island history, registration history, and license plates. But the way I'm going to frame this is in these 4 particular characteristics or attributes of our modern registration system that have been in place, in my eyes, since 1918, how they came about over that 17-year period. And so here are the 4 attributes. The first is, when we register our cars today, we go to the state. We go to the state DMV, and that's the case in any state. That was not the case prior to 1918 everywhere, and at the very beginning. Of the 48 states, 35 had some sort of local registration system before the state took over. So municipalities registered cars and licensed drivers, and counties did in some cases. And in some cases, there was overlap, and you'll see cars with 2 and 3 license plates. And what happened over this 17-year period is that state after state introduced state registrations, and as that happened, the municipalities fell by the wayside, and in most cases when states passed registration laws, they specifically prohibited municipalities from having similar laws. The second characteristic is this periodic renewal that we have. We now have to renew our license plates every year or every 2 years, and we pay a fee to do that. And that wasn't always the case either. Here in Rhode Island, our first license plates were permanent. They were considered permanent. There was a one-time fee. This was in 1904, and I'll get more into the Rhode Island history later, and I'll show you a few of the plates. But I'm just now pointing out the distinction between permanent and annual renewals. Back in the now we didn't see this in the later states as states started their registration programs in the teens. But in the very early years, I'm assuming that just officials didn't understand how automobiles were going to take off and how many registrations there would be. So the very early registrations, like in Rhode Island and other states, the license plates don't have a year designation on them, and they were considered permanent. And in fact, in Rhode Island in 1904, under our original motor vehicle registration law, people paid a one-time fee of $2. They got an undated plate, and that was it. And in fact, the fee was just to cover the cost of the license plates. There was no registration fee to speak of. And I think the reason for that is, well, I don't know why they didn't charge a registration fee, but I think all they wanted to do at the time, from reading the old articles and reading the law, I think all they were trying to do at the time was put a number on a car so that they could identify it. I don't think there was any thought of using annual renewals or even registration fees to fund infrastructure. But as there became more and more cars, obviously the automobilists needed infrastructure. They needed to generate money. So in our second registration law in 1908, that's when it was instituted annual renewals for registrations. So that's the second one, this idea that now we have to renew registrations, and back then in many states, registrations were permanent. The third attribute of our modern registration systems that was developed over this 17-year period is license plates. Is modern, well, not modern so much, but license plates provided by the Department of Motor Vehicles. This was not always the case. Of the 48 states, when they introduced their state registration systems, half of them provided uniform license plates to motorists at the same time. In the other half of the states, motorists had to make their own license plates or buy them privately. I'm assuming that in small towns and even in larger cities, that there were, maybe you'd go to the hardware store. I'm going to have one, I'll show you. I don't know exactly who made them. When you look in the old automobile publications, sometimes you'll see ads for companies that made license plates, you could send away for one. But I'm assuming locally there were hardware store or people that had the tools and the materials to make license plates. And it's not like that was 1 or 2 states, that was a lot of states. And you had to, I mentioned that my first point was that in some cases you had to register, you didn't always register with the state. In some cases you registered with the city or town you lived in. And in those cases, some of the larger cities provided uniform license plates, but some of them did not. So not only did you have homemade, I call them homemade plates, usually people didn't make their own. Sometimes they painted the number on their car, they could in most places, they just had to display the number. But I don't think too many people made their own license plates. But the point is that you could have had these homemade license plates, we call them pre-state plates in the hobby because they're before the state plates. You could have them for states and you could have them for cities. So the third attribute is the idea, this whole idea of license plates has not always been a government-provided item that comes with a registration. And then the fourth one is registration reciprocity, being able to drive between states or even just between different cities and not having to stop at the border and changing your license plate to the state that you're entering because you've already registered there. And I'll talk a little bit about that as well, and I'll show you an example of plates that were issued before there was reciprocity between 2 jurisdictions. So let me begin by going a little bit more into detail on this idea of local registrations. It's not surprising that there were local registrations when you stop and think about it. I think we've probably, as people that are interested in automobiles, I think we've probably already all heard at some point the stories about either an excerpt from a newspaper article from back in this era, or somehow we've heard about news reports about people who were stopped by the police. Now again, I'm talking about back in the London to Brighton era, the before 1905 eras mostly, where people would have been stopped by the police because they thundered through the town at 12 miles an hour, right? Kicking up dust and scaring horses, and pedestrians are running for cover and all this kind of stuff. And it was just, this is where the enforcement had to happen, right? The local officials, after this happened 2 or 3 or 4 times, weren't going to turn to the state and say, hey, you got to come down here and do something about this. The local officials were in the business of administering their municipalities. And so they were going to pass a law for this new technology, just like or an ordinance, just like they passed ordinances for any other new technology. So it's not surprising that, that cities and towns and counties issued registrations. Let me show you an example of an early city plate. This is a St. Louis, Missouri plate from 1908. It's probably pretty plain. I mean, it's probably pretty clear. St. Louis began registration in 1902, for example. And this is a uniform plate made by a manufacturer. It's porcelain enamel. It looks just like a lot of the state issue plates, except for it was issued by a city. And in fact, St. Louis has an interesting registration history. People in St. Louis City who wanted to travel into St. Louis County in some years had to buy a St. Louis County plate as well. So, so local registration is the first point I wanted to discuss because, as I said, it was in 35 of the states. So that was how most people got introduced to the idea of having to register their vehicles. Now, the idea of license plates not being provided by the government, this is an early owner-provided plate. This is what we call a pre-state plate from South Dakota. South Dakota began registration in 1905. Which is early for a Midwestern state, but they didn't provide uniform license plates until 1913. So this happens to be in 1912. We know that because of the registration number that's on it. We have records to indicate in which years the numbers were issued. And this was probably made by made in a hardware store someplace locally. The construction is interesting. It's, as I said, it's leather. It's a metal frame, which this one has a little bit of deterioration in this corner, but it lets us see how it was made. It's a metal frame with 2 pieces of black leather stitched around the outside and right on the inside, and then aluminum house numbers attached. And if you've taken a good look at the Roush and Lang over here, right, Donald?
Exactly.
What else? Is there something else that has this construction in here? Just the Roush and Lang?
Just the Roush and Lang, I think, is actually the only one that has the leather fenders.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's also interesting, just to interrupt you for a second, that thinking about South Dakota and the density even today in South Dakota, so it's obviously not about the density of motor vehicles, just the fact that the local jurisdictions felt that they had a need to keep track of these things.
That's right. And that's what, as I said, in Rhode Island there was no registration fee. It was just about having a number on the vehicle to keep track of it. So the states, let me give you a little bit of chronology about how this all played out. In this 17-year period when states gradually introduced registration. The first, well, I'm even going to go earlier than 1901. The first examples that we've seen, and this plays into the idea of local regulation. Apparently, and Donald, I expect you'll know something about this too, that you can interject relevant information here. Apparently, one of the places that the earliest motorists liked to take their vehicles were public parks. The earliest, so Central Park in New York, the Emerald Necklace Parks in Boston, the system of parks. Apparently, the tree-lined boulevards and the scenery. Remember, as Evan and Donald were saying last month, the early vehicles were not practical transportation. That wasn't their purpose. They were diversions. And it makes sense that the early motorists would take their vehicles to public parks, these large open spaces in urban areas, especially when you consider that it's entirely possible that they were prohibited from operating their vehicles on city streets, because we know that that's the case. We know that cities for a while resisted automobiles because it was so new and it was so it was threatening to a lot of the different aspects of the population. So the earliest references we found to what could be considered registration, it's not registration like we have today, but some public official keeping a book and keeping track of automobiles was in 1899 in Boston and New York, these public parks, but there's no evidence of them having issued license plates. The first examples that we know of something akin to a license plate being issued was in Fairmount Park in Philadelphia. And I'm not familiar with Fairmount Park other than in this context of this history, but my understanding is it's a large open park, nicely landscaped, was back then, what is today. And this is where people would take their vehicles, their horseless carriages, and what they did is, in addition to keeping the park officials, in addition to keeping some sort of a log as to who was authorized to bring their vehicles into the park, they also issued small black leather constructed similarly to that South Dakota plate, but they were about 4 or 5 inches square, black leather pads with numbers painted on them. This was in 1900. And this is the first, this is the predecessor of the modern license plate. These little markers were to be displayed on the rear of the car so that they could be seen there. And as Donald said earlier, this is all revolutionary. When Evan and Donald were talking about the early cars last month, Evan made the point that they weren't refining something that had been done before. This was brand new. And the same thing, this is the same situation faced by the public officials that had to keep track of these vehicles. They were trying to decide whether license plates should go on the front and back of a car or on the sides. There was no rule book. So the Philadelphia, the Fairmount Park Commissioners were the first people to issue a marker that was kind of similar to license plates, the modern license plates. And they're very scarce today, as you might expect. Part of the problem with them is they don't say anything on them other than a number. So if somebody found one and didn't know what it was, it doesn't really look like much of anything.
A coaster.
Well,
a coaster. Yeah.
A coaster, right. So it shouldn't. The point there is that it shouldn't surprise us that the registration started early locally because those are the people that needed to deal with it. So after. That's in 1900. So now we're going to start into the 1901 to 1917 period when when the states started to come on board and begin registration. What we see in the early laws that brought about registration laws, or that brought about regulation of automobiles in general very early on, is that I put the laws, the vehicle-related laws that I see from this era into three categories. The operational laws, which are basically where people can operate their vehicles when possibly maybe there's days that they can't use them or times of day, and mostly speed limits. When I'm researching registration-related things, either in old newspapers or in the general laws of a state or in the minutes of the Massachusetts Highway Commission, some government board responsible for the application of registrations, it's always, by the time they got to registration in most places, there was already speed limit, operational related laws, speed limit laws, or ordinances on a local basis. But then when it comes to the registration and the driver's licenses, generally those are two separate laws or ordinances, if it's local, not passed simultaneously. Here in Rhode Island, our first law, the 1904 Act, only addressed registration and license plates and fees. Nothing about, as I said earlier, nothing about annual renewals of registrations and nothing about driver's licenses. Only 4 years later, in the 1908 law, did they introduce annual renewals to raise some revenue and driver's licenses. Chicago is a good example to use here because it's both an example of a municipality issuing regulations, but also how it leads into the state. So here's what happened in Chicago. In late 1899, an ordinance was passed requiring drivers to be licensed. Now that's very early for any vehicle-related laws. As I said off the top, cars just began to be manufactured on a commercial basis for sale to the public in 1897. So in 1899, at the end of the year, Chicago passes an ordinance requiring drivers to be licensed. So they took an opposite approach of Rhode Island. They went to driver's licenses first. The first licenses were issued in early 1900, I believe in February. And then in 1901, they added a registration law. And for the first 2 years in Chicago, they just issued a small metal disc, a little bit larger than a silver dollar, and that was the official marker that would go on the vehicle as evidence that it was registered. And of course, all the cars, or practically all the cars at that point, were like the curved dash over here. They were open cars. You could see right into them. This disc would be attached to the dashboard or someplace else in the driver's compartment. And there was a paper certificate issued. In most cases, in most places that did this, that used this disc system, they would issue a paper certificate and the disc, and they would have the same serial number on them. So that's what Chicago did for registration for 1901 and 1902. And then in 1903, they determined that they wanted to use license plates. So they added a license plate provision to the ordinance, to the law, but motorists had to make their own license plate or get their own license plate with like the South Dakota or something similar. There were all kinds of those pre-state plates, by the way, but they weren't all just leather. That's the most common style, but you could I've even seen some made in porcelain, but it was common to have them with a metal frame with metal numbers in it, and the numbers could be changed, kind of like the New Jersey 1908 plate that's on the table over here. There are a number of different ways to make them. So in Chicago in 1903, they go with this homemade license plate model, but that didn't work so well for them apparently, because in 1904, the city went out and bought uniform license plates from a vendor and started to issue those. Then finally, in 1907, 3 years later, the state of Illinois passes its state registration law, and it renders obsolete all of the municipal registrations that existed in the state. So Chicago is out of the registration and licensing business. But that's just a good example of how it evolved in many places. Not every place, because in Rhode Island we didn't have municipal registrations. I think I mentioned earlier that 35 of the states had some form of local municipal registration, county registration. The other 13 states didn't, and we were in that boat. And in fact, all of the New England states were, and it's just because we started registration so early in this part of the country. There wasn't time for municipalities to have a need to issue registrations. But if you look at states like Oklahoma and Louisiana, they didn't start state registration until 1915. That was late. That was late. So by that time, there were already robust local registration systems throughout the state. There are New Orleans license plates. There are Tulsa, Oklahoma license plates. There are Oklahoma City license plates. And that's the case in lots of states that started registration late. Nevada didn't start state registrations until 1916. And Texas and South Carolina didn't start until 1917. So Texas has an enormously interesting, I was going to say enormously complex. It's not really that complex, but it's a very interesting system of registrations before the state took over. Florida has a fascinating and very complex system of registration. So that's part of the appeal here of this period, is this 1901 to 1917 period, is that all the states are experimenting at this time. There's a lot of trial and error, right? There's no consistency. There's very little consistency. There's very few states that you can say, yeah, they did things essentially the same way. There's a lot of variety, and it's fascinating from a research standpoint and from a regulatory standpoint, and the license plates are very interesting as well. So anyway, getting back to my example, I was talking about Chicago, where they went through this whole process, and then the state introduced their law in 1907. And in fact, at the end of 1907, half of the states had instituted their own state registration system. So by 1905 and 1906 and 1907, we begin to see fewer municipalities starting their registration systems because the states are taking over. I'm just going to give you a few statistics here, or not statistics, but cities. So as I mentioned, Chicago started in 1901. Cleveland, Kansas City, St. Louis, and Denver, and the park system in Cincinnati started registrations in 1902. In 1903, there were a number of cities. 1903 seems to be a year that there was a lot of change. I'm not sure exactly why, but a lot of cities came on with registrations in 1903. But before I get any further than that, let me go back to the beginning in terms of state registrations, because the first state to require registration, and that's, I keep using this period of years of 1901 to 1917. It began in 1901 in New York. New York was way ahead of the curve on this. Is Donald still?
Yep.
Donald's your home state.
Indeed.
You should be proud. 1901, New York passes a law to require vehicles to be registered with the state. And I need to research this more, because it fascinates me, because I don't know why it was so early, but I'm sure there was a reason. But the reason I feel like it was so early and so revolutionary is because the next state to introduce statewide registration, which happens to be New Jersey, it didn't happen until 2 years later. So that's how far ahead of the curve New York was. And that's why we don't see any of these municipal registrations from any cities in New York. I'm sure, Albany, Schenectady, Rochester, Syracuse, Buffalo. Same thing in New England. There's no Providence plates, Newport plates, because the state started so early. But New York started earlier than anyone. So in New York, in 1901, there's New York State, and I mentioned Chicago, and Golden Gate Park in San Francisco began registration. And it was a short-lived system, of course, because the state of California took over pretty soon. But so that's all we happened in 1901. In 1902, there were no states that started registration, but as I mentioned, Denver, Colorado, Kansas City, St. Louis, Cincinnati Park System all started in 1902. And then in 1903 was a big year. And there were a number of cities started in 1903, Colorado Springs, Little Rock, Arkansas, Salt Lake City, Memphis, Des Moines, Detroit, New Orleans. The point is it was all over the country. But also in 1903, I mentioned New Jersey was the second state. Another 4 states and the District of Columbia started registrations in 1903. And the most significant thing about 1903 is, and this is a landmark, there's several landmarks mixed in here, is that in 1903, Massachusetts passed its registration law based to a large extent, I wouldn't say a large extent, but a significant extent on New York's law. And, but what Massachusetts did differently is that they issued uniform license plates, and it was the first state to do so. And this is a 1903 Massachusetts license plate. Porcelain enamel, fairly common material for the day. These were issued in pairs. And this was a permanent plate. These were issued in this style, but they enlarged the font for the state name after a while, and the numbers got larger. Of course, they got into 5 digits. But this was a 5-year plate. This style of plate was used in Massachusetts for 5 years. We know this is in 1903 because of the registration number on it. So that's the big news out of 1903. Connecticut also began registration in 1903, but was the only New England state to not provide uniform plates. Connecticut motorists had to make their own license, or procure their own license plates for the first 2 years. So as things went on, as time went on, there's just more states and more cities. In 1904, notably, Rhode Island started registration, which I had already mentioned, and provided uniform plates. We were the second state to provide uniform plates. We were the 8th state to start registration on a statewide basis, but we were the second to provide uniform plates, and I'll show you one of those in a few minutes. Michigan, Iowa, Maryland enacted its registration law 1 day before we did, and also Atlanta, Columbus, Ohio, Fort Worth, Jacksonville, Florida, San Antonio, Omaha, Milwaukee, so a lot more cities started in 1904. So again, we're seeing the balance tilt from municipalities to states as years go on, and I think I also mentioned that by the end of 1907, half of the states had instituted their program. So that's how this 17-year period played out. I mean, as time went on, there was not a year that went by in that period that another state, at least one other state, didn't introduce statewide registration. And I'm not going to go through all the rest of the details, but as I said earlier, one of the things that changed as time went on is that the states that started registration later didn't start with this permanent plates. They knew right off the top that they needed to do this annually to raise revenue on an annual basis, and so that's what they did. So I think that about covers the topics, the foundational characteristics of the registration systems that I started with. You now know about having to register your cars with cities or towns in some states before you registered with the state, and then gradually the states took over. We talked a little bit about permanent registrations versus registrations that had to be renewed, and we talked about homemade license plates or owner-provided license plates versus uniform license plates. The fourth point that I haven't addressed yet is reciprocity. And there's a photo on one of these two tables, I think it's this one, of a car in 1909 in Washington, D.C. And it's a wonderful photo. We have a lot of information about the gentleman who's driving it and his car. But on the back of the car is a Washington, D.C. plate, a Maryland plate, and a Virginia plate. And that's because that's where he wanted to go. Now, in some states that were up against these reciprocity restrictions, the states would only allow one plate on the car at a time. And it's not uncommon in some of the early photos, especially on runabouts and smaller cars where there wasn't a lot of storage space, that there'd be a little leather compartment on the back of the car, presumably for other things, but that's where the license plates were kept. Now, obviously, this is not a problem in some place where this is not something you'd see in places that don't have reciprocity issues or that's not near a state border. But for example, in our hobby, we see occasionally New York and New Jersey plates on one plate. So if somebody lived in New York, they'd have their New York plate. This is before uniform plates, usually. This is where it's all homemade plates or owner-provided plates. And there'd be a New York registration on one side and a New Jersey registration on the other side. And when the people got to the state line, they would just turn their license plate over.
And you think that was invented with James Bond?
Yeah, no. It was necessary a long time before that. So here's an example of that. These two plates have been bolted together for 106 years now, I think. No, more than that. Yeah, 106 years. This is a 1917 Maryland plate on the top and a Washington, D.C. plate of the style issued from 1914 to 1917 on the bottom. And unfortunately, I don't have registration records on this number. I hope to find them at some point because it's interesting. The internet obviously is a wonderful resource for researching, and back in these days, in many states, including Rhode Island, registration data a list of the new registrations of the previous week would be published in the Sunday paper. And so we can go in the papers now I use newspapers.com, on some database like that, and look at the old newspapers and find out who had these plates. They haven't published data from this era yet, but I hope to find out who these belong to. But anyhow, this is what you would see in jurisdictions where there were no reciprocity agreement. Here are examples of those plates, just so you can, little nicer condition, so you can see what they looked like when they were new. The 17 Maryland is a nice deep green on white, and here's the District of Columbia plate. But, and in fact, these two jurisdictions had the longest lack of reciprocity, the latest lack of reciprocity of any. I mentioned that by the end of 1917, most jurisdictions, all of the states had introduced statewide registration by 1917. That was the end of the era with the municipality-issued plates, registrations, and so on. But there are a few exceptions to that, and one of them is Washington, D.C. and Maryland. They didn't reach a reciprocity agreement until early 1924, which is really remarkable that late there were still people with that had to have two license plates. So let's see, I think that's all I wanted to cover with early registration. Again, to sum that up, at the beginning of 1918, there were no more homemade plates, and in fact, that was the last vestige of the pioneer period, as I call it. Florida did away with owner-provided plates and issued uniform plates as of the beginning of 1918, and that was the last vestige of any of the old characteristics, except for a few exceptions. Like I said, there was no reciprocity in these two jurisdictions until 1924. There were a few states like South Carolina and Missouri. Missouri allowed local registrations in some form after 1918, and in fact, in some cases, that's still in effect today for hire vehicles, for public service vehicles, taxi cabs and livery cars and things like that. There are still local regulations that require those to be registered. But in terms of privately owned vehicles, after 1918, there was essentially no more private registration, no more municipal registrations, and license plates were being provided by every state to motorists as of 1918. So even though the systems have changed somewhat since then, I think that's the period where the basis of our registration system today, what we know about registering cars and license plates, I think that's when it was all settled. Let me show you a few other early plates and some landmark plates. This is just because we are in southern New England, and I showed you the first issue Massachusetts plate. This is a first issue Connecticut plate. Now, as I said, Connecticut began registration in 1903. There were no local registrations in any of the New England states, including Connecticut. But Connecticut does stand out in New England as being the one state that required motorists to provide their own license plates for the first 2 years, 1903 and 1904. In 1905, they came out with these uniform porcelain and enamel plates, and these were used until 1909. And I'm guessing these were seen as not as legible as they would have liked, because in 1910 they came out with new plates, and this is what they look like. So they went from this to this. And this is when Connecticut started with annual plates. They looked like this for another 3 years in just different colors. They changed the color every year, and then they put CONN on them and began to put the year designation. This is in here just to represent early embossed steel plates. And in New England here, we hung on to porcelain enamel fairly late. But states that started registration in the teens, like Iowa, began registering vehicles. They began registering vehicles earlier, but they began providing uniform license plates to motorists in 1911. They started out with embossed steel right from the beginning. And the only reason I wanted to highlight the embossed steel construction is because it was what all states adopted by the early 1920s. And if you've seen license plates, or if you have old license plates, they're probably embossed steel. This is an interesting construction. It has kind of a funky, really thick embossing on the edges. The other thing that's interesting about this is the number is pretty high. It's 141,000 in 1915. Rhode Island didn't get to 141,000 registrations until about 1939 or 1940 or something, so. This is a landmark plate. This is a very important license plate in US history, in my eyes. Not this particular one, but this issue. This is a 1916 to 19 California plate. And you know, when I showed you the Massachusetts plate and this first issue Connecticut plate over here, they were permanent plates at the time. They were used for multiple years. But what's different, this was used for multiple years too. What's different about this is it was not created as a permanent plate. It was thought to be, or was designed to be, a multi-year plate validated every year with a distinctive marker. This is essentially what we have today. A multi-year plate. Today we have multi-year plates validated with stickers, different colored stickers. So we can tell at a glance if a registration is, if a plate is valid. California did this in 1916. The first tab that was on here, would have been on here, was a little natural lead, so a silvery gray bear, just the same bear design that's on the state flag. In 1917, they used these little yellow poppy tabs with a little dash of red on it. That would have gone on there. In 1918, it was a green bell, presumably representing a mission bell. And then in 1919, the last year, was these red stars. So again, they were way ahead of the curve on this. And I don't know why they didn't continue it, but they didn't. In 1920, to replace this, they went to an embossed steel plate, and that's what they did right up to World War II, just like just about every other state did. But this isn't a relevant plate in US history. And this is kind of, if that's number one, this is kind of 1A. This is another one. This is a second multi-year US plate. This one is also relevant. Obviously, it's Connecticut, 1937. This is also relevant because it was used for so long. These plates were used for 11 years. So most of them wound up at the end with a green tab on it that says 47. But this was specifically designed, as I'm sure the California was, to be a quote-unquote permanent plate. And it's natural aluminum. There's no background paint on it. It's just black ink on natural aluminum. They tried to make it as utilitarian and simple as possible. And it's very heavy aluminum. And they lasted pretty well. This is a significant plate. This is here to represent, this plate is here representing 3 states, Iowa and Arizona, as well as Nebraska. This is a 1922 Nebraska plate, as you can see. What's different about this is the numbering format. And this doesn't really ring true, or it doesn't really make sense to people in New England mostly, because it's nothing that we did here. But this number is a county-coded registration number. So 30 means Clay County. This is a Clay County, Nebraska plate. The 66th plate issued in Clay County. This was revolutionary at the time. If you know something about the Midwestern states or Southern states, they have a much more county-centric culture than we do. There's not even county government in Rhode Island, I don't think, anymore, in Massachusetts. Or there's minimal, there's court system, there's some count, but we don't deal with our counties on a regular basis, if at all. In the Midwest, southern states, some of the lesser populated states, the county is most residents' contact with government. And so Nebraska, Arizona, and Iowa simultaneously in 1922 devised this new numbering format, and it's totally become part of the culture. If you go to the Wikipedia page of any county in Nebraska, in the very top paragraph where it gives the basic demographic information about the county, it tells you what their license code number is. Nebraska has only changed their county numbers once since 1922, and they changed them to letters in 1951, and it caused such an uproar they went back to numbers, and it's just it's just the same now. There is a Clay County 66 plate on Nebraska today, and before World War II, 20 states did some sort of county coding on their license plates, either numbers like this Or in some states, they put the county name right on it. The first state to do that was Kentucky in 1927. There's one on a table over here. And it's interesting when you look at that, you get a sense of how important the county was to people in these states, because the county number is huge across the top of the plate, and then it says KY in smaller letters in the corner of the plate. Mississippi did the same thing. The name of the county across the top, and then MISS in the center, down the center in much smaller letters. So counties are very important to a lot of people. It's just like if you're at a traffic light here, or if you're behind a car that's hesitating, and it's a New Jersey plate or New York plate, you know they're from out of state, but they're kind of from around here. But if you see it's from Montana or Arizona or someplace far away, whatever it tells you, however you react to it, it tells you that the person's from far away. Well, in these states that use county coding, it was the same thing. People in Clay County knew if they saw a plate with 30 on it, it was one of their neighbors. And they knew the numbers of the counties around them. But if they saw a county number that they had never seen before, that person might as well just have been from Massachusetts or Washington or Florida, because they were from away. So county coding is important. After World War II, another 14 states used it in some form, so a total of 34 states have used county coding at some point, and a lot of states still do today. Registration numbers are still county coded in Idaho, Montana, South Dakota, Wyoming, Nebraska, Hawaii, and Alabama, and a lot of other states still have the county name on their plate. So it's very important. It's a landmark, even though it doesn't mean much to New Englanders. 1936 is a significant year because even though slogans were introduced before that, and graphic elements were introduced to license plates before that, is shown in some of the plates on the tables over here. One state in 1936 introduced a graphic element to their license plates, and it's still there. And another state very far away introduced a slogan to their license plates in 1936. Just coincidental, it's the same year, and the slogan is still there. And in both cases, those elements, the slogan and the graphic element, have become synonymous with those states, totally become a part of their culture. And I think if anybody tried to take away that slogan or that graphic element, I think there'd be a revolt. Can anybody think about what the slogan that's been on one state's plates for 87 years might be, or the graphic element?
Live free or die.
No, that came about in 1970, but that's a slogan that's been around a long time. Anybody else? What's that?
Sunshine State?
No. In fact, it's interesting you should say that, because Florida has had Sunshine State for a number of years, but there's a 1932 New Mexico plate on the table back there that says Sunshine State. So New Mexico was a Sunshine State before Florida was. Yeah.
First state?
Did you say the first state? Delaware? No, it's a good guess. That was 1963. 1963. No. I thought somebody might say America's Dairyland. America's Dairyland has been on Wisconsin's plate since 1940. No, this is the slogan in the state. Right? Don't you know that Maine is vacation land, right? Isn't that a part of the image? Yeah, 87 years. I thought somebody might get this one. I didn't expect anybody to get the graphic element, because it's pretty far away. Anybody want another guess? A guess on the graphic element? What's it?
Wyoming.
Yeah, Wyoming. Yeah. The bucking bronco has been on Wyoming's plates since 1936. And even more so, I think, than Maine, if they tried to take this off of these plates, I don't think that would go well at all.
County number 2?
That's a county number, exactly. Very good, that's a county number. I'm not sure which one, but that's a county number. It's interesting, too, with the county numbers, different states assign them in different ways. Iowa assigned its original, they don't use county numbers anymore, they have the county name on the plate in Iowa, but originally Iowa assigned the county numbers by alphabetically. And that got them into trouble because, they used 1 through 9, but then they got the 2-digit numbers, and the Polk County and Lynn County, the counties with higher populations that they need more space for digits, had 2-digit numbers. What they should have done was, like Nebraska did, is they used the lowest numbers for the most populated counties. But states have used all sorts of different options for numbering their counties. This is my last landmark plate to show you, and we're going back to Connecticut, and this is the 37 plate again that I said was used for 11 years. This is the first vanity plate in the country. Connecticut introduced vanity license plates in the late 1930s. And originally, when they decided to do this, the idea is that they would be rewards for people with good driving records. These were going to be safe driver plates. And they never did that. By the time they introduced them, they were available to everyone. But the intention was that they would be for safe drivers. I think when they tried to really figure out how they were going to do that, I think managing it wasn't going to be as easy as they thought. So they abandoned that idea. So that's some landmark plates and early plates, and there are more on the tables. I originally had a lot of the plates on the tables in my presentation, but we would have been here all night. So be sure to check out some of the landmark plates on the tables. And speaking of landmarks, here's a Rhode Island landmark. This is what our first Rhode Island license plates look like. This is a 1904 Rhode Island plate. And I spoke earlier about the 1904 law, that these were permanent, there was no renewals. Somebody paid $1 for this plate because they got 2 of them for $2. This plate was issued to a gentleman in Woonsocket with a homemade steam-powered car. And then a few years later, they wanted to be a little bit more legible, so they increased the size of the numbers in the state name. This one was issued in mid-1907. This comes right from the beginning in the spring or summer, probably June or July of 1904. There was a real demand for the low numbers at the beginning, right from the beginning. And people were calling the Secretary of State's office, which was the original agency to handle registrations before the State Board of Public Roads took over. People were calling at the Secretary of State's office trying to get the low numbers. And in fact, I've mapped I've kept track of, I don't know how you describe it, but I've mapped the lowest numbers. And the lowest numbers up to, I think, about 70 were given out over a long period of time, not in order, which suggests to me that those numbers were set aside for people and they could have them whenever they came in for them. But around 70 or 80, I think, is when you start seeing the numbers being assigned sequentially. And I found a reference somewhere, I forget where, it's a long time ago now, but I did the book back in the 90s, so a lot of that's gone from my mind. But there was some sort of a newspaper article or some reference like that from back in those days, somebody lamenting that they had such a high registration number. And it was something like 83 or something like this. So back in if you've seen like the American back there or the curved dash olds, you probably haven't looked as carefully as I usually do for things like this, but on the backs of most of these cars, there was usually a bracket for license plate, integral with the tail light. But the front was not so easy. A lot of, especially in the very early cars, the horseless carriage era cars, the license plates usually were just hung from leather straps from the front axle, and that was not particularly good for the license plates. But here's one that still has a leather strap. So we're occasionally found like this with a leather strap still on it. This is the first dealer plate issued in Rhode Island. In this era, cars, trucks, anything privately owned except for motorcycle got a plate out of the numeric sequence. There were no special plates for any types except for motorcycles and dealers. Manufacturers and dealers had the A prefix, and motorcycles plates had the B prefix. And this is A1. This was issued to the Davis Automobile Company in Providence, which was on Dorrance Street, right where I still call it the Biltmore Hotel. I think it's the Graduate Hotel now, but that block was a little automobile block. It was I've got a picture of it here somewhere if you want to see it, but that was a one-story block with all sorts of auto agencies, parts houses and things like that. And that's where Davis was, and this was his plate. Let me give you, before I move on, let me give you a few statistics about Rhode Island at that time. In the very first of all, the first registration in Newport was issued to Benjamin H. Richards of 103 Church Street, if you're from Newport, and he got registration number 30, and he had a locomobile steamer. But in the first listing book, we have these listing books where they listed all the registration transactions, and in the first one, published in July of 1904, so a few months after registration took effect, there were 733 transactions. And so there's more data in that book than any of the later books because there's more space for the data. As the books got to be 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 registrations, it just took up too much space and too much time to publish it. By the time they published it, it was the end of the year and it was time to do it all again. But the first book has 733 transactions. And this surprised me, actually. I've always heard that, and I'm not saying I don't think it's true, but I've always heard that in the early days, the split between gas-powered cars, steam-powered cars, and electric-powered cars was pretty even until eventually gasoline moved ahead. But in 1904, 2/3 of the cars registered in Rhode Island were powered by gasoline. And there were 129 steam cars, 17%, and 15% of the cars were electric. Body styles, 59% were runabouts, 35% were touring cars, and the remaining 6% were other body styles, which probably are akin to runabouts. The colors of the first cars, the colors of the cars in 1904, and this will dispel any of this nonsense about any color as long as it's black. 1/3 of the cars were black, 1/3 of the cars were red, and 1/3 of the cars were other colors. Green was the most popular color in that third group, 15% of the cars were green, and so on. And in terms of makes, the most popular make in 1904 in Rhode Island was a Pope. Now, I don't know if that was a Pope Hartford or a Pope Toledo or a Pope Robinson, because Pope licensed a lot of different makes, but it's only listed as Pope. There were 66 Popes, 60 Stanleys, Knox, Cadillac, Oldsmobile, Autocar, and Winton. There were more than 40 of all of those makes. 22 locomobiles, 13 Fords in 1904, which makes sense because it was before the Model T, 4 years before the Model T. So the early statistics are interesting, and if you have a low registration, in particular if you have a registration below 3,300 or so, or if you want to know more information about Newport registrations, I have with me all the data that I have, which is sorted by surname and registration number. There were 112 registration transactions in Newport in 1904. And we'll leave the statistics at that. I could go on all night about those. This is Rhode Island's second style of plate. So I spoke about our 1908 law was passed and it began to require annual registrations, and driver's licenses also began to be required in Rhode Island, in 1908. This plate was issued on February 1st of 1909. And I actually think that this Connecticut plate was used from 1905 to 1909. I kind of think that they may have had this in mind when they designed this. And while these were issued, these continued to be used. So from 1908 to 1912, both plate styles were in use. And then in 1912, they decided they needed to get rid of these black plates and give everybody new plates to see who was driving around with invalid plates, sort of like they're doing today, right? So this is the third style of Rhode Island license plate. These were used from 1912 to 1917. And it baffles me why they're not dated, annual plates, because by this time, and especially by 1917, when these came out for the cars, just about every state was issuing annual dated plates. Rhode Island hung on to this undated model for a long, long time, longer than just about any other state. I brought the two just to show the difference in the size of the numbers. When they got to 5 digits, they went to this style. These plates were numbered up to 35,017, and that's where it ended in 1917. So these are more common than the earlier ones, as you might expect. Still nice plates to have, though. Just a few more Rhode Island plates here. This is a truck plate. Rhode Island introduced special plates for trucks in 1912 with a letter X prefix. That's what this is.
Did that imply commercial or just that it was a truck?
That's a good question. It's not entirely clear. If you had a commercial car, would you get one of those plates? I'm inclined to say yes, but it's not clear. Like today, there's commercial plates on lots of privately owned, any privately owned truck has a combination plate or a commercial plate. So yeah, that's a good question. I always think of it as commercial, anything owned by a business used in commerce. So in 1917, we did away with, coincidentally, to when all the states got to uniform registrations. In 1918, we went to dated annual plates like all the other states. These are flat steel, made by a company in Ohio. Rhode Island license plates were a question I get a lot. Rhode Island license plates were not made by the prison until 1937 for the 1938 plates. And the first states to make their plates in their prisons were Oklahoma and Pennsylvania made their 1917 plates, presumably in 1916. That's when prison labor started to make license plates. And license plates are still not made by prisoners in all states. There's a number of states, including Rhode Island now, that the plates are not made in the prison. Some states have never made their plates in their prisons. And what you may have noticed about these as well is that they're different lengths. That began in 1918. They began to vary the length of the plate based on the number of characters in the registration number. And I put together this little panel to show that, just because I have difficulty holding up 5 license plates at a time. But this shows you the different sizes. These are all from the 1930s, obviously, but this shows you the different sizes of license plates. And lots of states did this. Lots of states did this. Rhode Island plates varied in their length until 1946, and then they went back to a uniform size. This is a public service plate. That's be for an ambulance or anything, any vehicle. I mean, we had taxi plates by then, but a livery vehicle, anything like that for hire plates. And this is a truck plate down the bottom with the X prefix. A few more Rhode Island plates just to finish up. Oh, this is interesting. Not Rhode Island, right? But we know that this was made by the same company that made Rhode Island plates, because on the back of it, I don't know if you'll be able to see it from there, but on the back of it is a 1919 Rhode Island plate, painted over. So apparently the manufacturer spoiled some Rhode Island plates, or an order got canceled or something, and so they just flipped it over and made some plates for Nevada. It's probably more valuable as a Nevada plate than a Rhode Island plate, but I have it because it's a Rhode Island plate.
Is that common? Is there a lot of them like that, mistakes?
No.
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 So that's a collector's dream.
It's interesting. There are some like that from Nevada that also have Massachusetts plates on the back.
Really?
Yeah, but there are not a lot. In fact, I can't think of another instance of another state's plates like that's an 18 Nevada. I can't think of another instance, because you got to remember, most of the plates were embossed, so that recycling wouldn't work. It was only when they were this flat steel that they could do something like this. So this is the only example. 18 Nevada is the only example I know of that did that, but I have seen Massachusetts plates on the back of these too. But again, it has to be a state that they're making plates for, and they didn't make plates for many states. 1921, we were among the last states to adopt embossed steel plates. Here's in 1921. The last 5 states to adopt embossed steel: Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Alaska, and Hawaii. So we're in good company. We issued embossed plates, either steel or aluminum, for 102 years, until the beginning of this year.
We still issue, generally.
Right, for some types. Some types are still made embossed, but I'm just thinking about passenger car plates. That's right?
So if you, not to interject, but if you have a specialty plate, like Plum Beach, or charity plate, Patriots, Red Sox, those will still be made by the prison.
Yeah.
Whereas your general issue new ocean plates that are beginning to come on the road starting last month, those are now made by 3M.
Mhm.
So the passenger plates for charity will still be embossed.
Mhm.
The new ones.
Regular plates are not.
Yeah, general issue, what we get out of the drawer when you get a plate, no.
Rhode Island, unfortunately, does not have a particularly colorful history. From 1918 to World War II, all of the even-numbered year plates are white with black, white characters on a black background, and the odd-numbered year plates are black on a white background. And that's why I brought some multicolored plates, just to show you that there's life outside of Rhode Island when it comes to license plates. But this is just an example of how this is the earliest bus plate I've ever seen from Rhode Island, that they played around with the design a little bit to include the type name. I dug this up underground in Providence in the 80s. It's the only one I've ever seen. Let me end with this. This is the #1 passenger car plate. This was issued to Dr. Roland Robinson, to whom the first registration was issued in Rhode Island. Now, Dr. Robinson lived in Wakefield, And it's an old Rhode Island family, from what I understand. And this was the year he died. And he passed the plate, the registration, to his son, whose name was also Roland Robinson. Now, how did he get it? I get that question a lot. Dr. Robinson's brother was named Benjamin Robinson. He was a state senator. Senator Robinson sponsored the registration bill in the Senate. It was called the Kane Act. Henry Kane was the legislator in the House who proposed the first vehicle registration law. But he didn't have a car. And neither did Senator Robinson, who sponsored the bill in the Senate. But Senator Robinson's brother had a car. And he got this as a reward for getting the Kane Act through the state Senate. And it's still with the family as far as I know. When the registration reached 100 years in 2004, I sent a note to a woman who was the second Roland Robinson's daughter. And I just sent her a copy of the page of the listing book that showed when her grandfather, her husband's grandfather, paid the $2 fee to get his registration. And she wrote me back a nice note. I suspect most of these are probably still surviving. I don't think this family threw too many plates away. This number was known to be significant back then, and of course it's still significant today. I'm very pleased to have this. That's all I've got. I'll be happy to take any questions anybody has.
Ocean State.
Yes, Ocean State.
1970. When did that start?
1972. October of 1972. A couple of milestones, and of course I didn't bring anything that new, but in 1972, Rhode Island plates became reflectorized. They started covering the background. I'm looking around here, I don't have a single one, and I usually travel with that stuff. Rhode Island plates began to be reflectorized in 1972, and that's when Ocean State was added. The slogan before that was "Discover" on painted black on aluminum plates. So 1972.
About the two initials.
What do you mean when did registration numbers begin to be comprised of two letters and three numbers? 1957. Yeah, registration numbers in Rhode Island were all numbers until 1937. In 1928, they reached 6 digits, which is really remarkable because, I mean, California reached, 7 states reached 1 million registrations between 1922 and 1926. And think about that. You take a state like Texas is one of those states. Texas didn't have any statewide registrations until 1917. And within 10 years, they needed to keep track of them. They needed to make 1 million sets of plates every year. They needed to mail them to everybody all across the state. California, on this plate, 1916 to 19, they made 600,000 pairs of these. Rhode Island has never, I think Rhode Island has about 70,000 plate registrations now, car, truck, and bus registrations. We've never, 877? We've never reached 1 million registrations in this state.
So I've got a plate, a Rhode Island plate from 1927, and there's 2 digits, a dot, and then 3 digits.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, and I think it just counts as 5 digits, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's just something that looks like this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what does that sequence mean?
Just general issue passenger, regular passenger plate. They just started at 1 and went as high as they needed to.
Why did they put the dot?
Just supposedly to make it more legible, just to separate the figures. Some states didn't. You'll see some out here that have 5 numbers with no separator. It's just the way Rhode Island did it. Yes, sir.
Do you know
Oh, I'm
about
sorry.
the year of manufacture legislation that passed just recently? Well, actually, in 2015
Yeah.
it passed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do
you
I-
know about that?
do-
How that all worked?
How it came about?
No, I can tell you how it came about. I was the one involved in
Uh-huh.
passing that legislation.
Okay.
But how you can get, it was enacted in 2015, and then the DMV sat on that thing for 4 or 5 years, didn't do anything about it.
Mhm.
I finally met with Craddock and told him that, you need to get off your butt and get this thing in place. So you can get a year of manufactured plate for your vehicle. You can buy it on eBay, to correspond with your motor.
Right, what he's talking about is in the hobby we call, or just in general, it's called year of manufacture. So if somebody has a car that qualifies for antique car plates, so 25 years old or older, if they want, they can now, in this state, register it with authentic plates from the year that the car was made. So this plate could be registered to the 1925 Model T over there. And there are certain rules. You have to have a pair of plates, and there's as you would expect, there are rules in the program. But a lot of states, most states, by now have year of manufacture. But yeah, that's new for Rhode Island. Yes, sir.
So reciprocity.
Yeah.
So, we see films in the Audrain Museum of cross-country trips and, people, even races for that matter.
Mm-hmm.
How would that work or not work when you might have had across 10 to 15 to 20 states and reciprocity was not even a thing? Could you paint an example of how that?
Presumably it was on a case-by-case basis. I mean, let me say this about reciprocity. Maryland and DC are clearly the outliers, 1924. The photo over here is from 1909. I was actually surprised to see that those jurisdictions hadn't established reciprocity by that point. The two of the four characteristics I named, one of them being the permanent registration versus annual renewal and reciprocity, both of those fell by the wayside fairly early. I'd be surprised if there were many adjoining jurisdictions that did not have reciprocity by 1910. Now, in the races before then, the rallies before then, cross country and so on and so forth, I don't know. It would depend on what the race organizers did, and it would depend on the jurisdictions they were going through. You got to remember, in some of these states, they didn't have registration yet. Colorado didn't have statewide registration, and their uniform plates came out in 1913. I forget whether they had registrations earlier than that. But the point is, it's interesting. I think about these pre-state plates, like the leather plate, this plate. There's a certain period of time where you could have gone to Main Street anywhere, USA, and seen, like in 1908, for example, this is the kind of plate that would be on a car in South Dakota in 1908. Next to it could be a Massachusetts car with a uniform plate dated September 1908. The next car might be from St. Louis with a city-issued plate on it, right? And the next car might be from someplace with a homemade leather plate from Elko, Nevada on it or someplace. I mean, there was this period of time, this 17-year period that I started speaking about, that, states were so inconsistent. That's part of the appeal of that period. But it's entirely possible that some of these rallies went through states that didn't have registration laws, or the rally, participants might have found out the hard way, that they were out of compliance with laws. Yeah. Yes.
Rich, when you talk about license plates in different sizes and so on, there was a time when license plates weren't all 6 inches by 12 inches.
That's right.
Different states put on long license plates and short license plates.
That's right.
Was it the automobile manufacturers that pushed to have the states have that uniformity so
yes,
that
it was.
they could design cars so that they didn't have to have these wide pockets?
Yes,
license plates?
yes, exactly. Yes, that's what happened. License plates varied in size in most states until 1956. Now, let me clarify. Maybe not all states did this where they had different length plates for plates with different numbers of characters on them, but there was no uniformity from state to state in the dimensions. And if you look on the tables over here, you'll see some very short plates or narrow plates, and there's just all kinds of shapes and not really different shapes, but there's all kinds of dimensions. Before 1957, it took effect in 1957, but leading up to 1957, the automobile manufacturers got together with the AAMVA, which is the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators, in other words, the leaders of all the DMVs or equivalent agencies around the country, and they came to an agreement. If you look at, I don't know Corvettes and other cars, but I think Corvette was one of them that as soon as that law passed, they made an indent in the trunk with like a piece of glass. So, now they could design cars that the license plates wouldn't look like an afterthought on them. They used to be on a kind of a T-shaped bracket that was adjustable, and after the size standardization in 1957, that changed everything. But yeah, that was a joint project between the AMVA and manufacturers. Sometimes people say the federal government did that, and I can understand where that people might think that, but as far as I know, the federal government has never had a role in anything having to do with registration beyond its own vehicles. So that was a joint project between the manufacturers and the states. Anything else? Yes, sir.
I just wanted to say that to the gentleman who asked the question about the year manufacturer, I
Yeah.
have plenty of information on that. I don't know who asked, but see me after.
Oh, you're the one who gave my plates, right?
Probably. Yes.
Any other
And
questions?
we designed that, I should say that we designed that program. Without Rich, that program would not have come to fruition the way that it did. His tremendous help, his knowledge, and his book were instrumental in making that program happen. I know that for most of the public, it was a while between when the legislation passed and when it was actually put into effect. But once we started to design the program and when it was put into effect, it was actually quite quick. And without Rich, you know, it still might not be implemented. So he was a tremendous help. Without him, it wouldn't have happened.
Thank you.
I want to say thank you for your help.
I'm happy to have helped.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Well, thank you all for coming. I hope you found it interesting. And if you have any questions, if you want me to look up your registration data from before 1908, or if you have any other questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.